Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Terry Henney, farm broadcaster at WSGW Radio in Saginaw, and we are talking beans. Talking beans, a presentation of BASF. Joining me this morning, a couple of fellas that know it all, so I really don't have to say any more. Right, Scott? Right, Kurt?
We'll remain silent.
We'll do our best.
I'm sure you will. Guys, I'm delighted to have you with us this morning. I know a lot of farmers aren't really doing too much out there, and I know a lot of suppliers are guardedly saying thank you to Mother Nature because with the supply chain issues and trying to get more inventory in for farmers, if we would have had an early start to this season, it might have been a little bit of a press, wouldn't you say, Scott?
Yeah, that's certainly maybe a blessing in disguise for us. We were meeting with some growers yesterday. We're taking advantage of the rain and getting some last minute information out, and we were reminded that a lot of these guys were done with beet planting this time last year, and it looks like we're at least a week, maybe 2 weeks out yet here.
Well, unfortunately, when we talk about beets, we'll just mention this because maybe there's some folks that don't know that the final processing season, is it over yet?
That's a great question, Terry, and I don't know if you have any additional insights into that, Kurt, but I know there's definitely been a lot of conversation about this processing season and how the spring's been.
Yeah, I've heard some stories here and there. Tonnage was up last fall, above expectations. So piling was good, maybe too good to some extent. I've heard some beets getting shipped back and applied to the field, getting chopped up. And some of the winter weather probably hasn't helped us. Some of the January rains and February rains that we had, and some of those what we call now normal 3 to 4 day temperature spikes that we see midwinter don't help that storage process long term. So all sorts of issues that growers are dealing with, whether it's beans, whether it's beets, wheat, etc.
And again, when we're talking about some of the other crops right offhand, all eyes obviously looking at wheat for the folks that put it in last fall. Scott, wouldn't you agree less than ideal conditions to put wheat in for some folks last fall?
Yeah, definitely. We had an early dry bean harvest season, so that first half of things up here in the Thumb and Saginaw Valley, I'd say went pretty well. But as we know, that the weather turned wet on us there, 1st of October, and anything that went in the later half of that season, it was a little bit of a challenge for sure.
Kurt?
Yeah, wheat's always a challenge. It's one of those crops that sometimes we joke it's a 12-month crop because we're literally managing it 11 months a year, and the 1 month we're not, we're probably trying to get seed, right? And so if you could get your wheat in timely last year, man, some of that wheat that got in probably the 3rd week of September, maybe 4th week before we hit some of those rains, some of that wheat grew great, maybe even too great to some extent. But the problem with wheat always is, when do you get your beans off, right? Whether it's dry beans, whether it's soybeans, then can you get that wheat planted on time? And man, Mother Nature opened up on us, I think, mid to late September last year, and it just never dried out. Right? I mean, it stayed moist the entire fall season. And you can, if you took an airplane flight this winter and there wasn't snow cover, you can see those ruts through most of those fields due to that harvest season. So, you opened the show saying, with the weather, most people are probably in the shop not doing much. That's probably a good thing, right? I looked at soil temperatures yesterday. For bulk of the state, we're still looking at 35 to 38, 39 degree 2-inch soil temperature. So wheat's not greening up yet. It's not time for your green up applications. So it's a good time to maybe sit and listen to the three of us and take some notes and kind of come up with your plan for this upcoming growing season.
I know right now, Kurt, we are looking short-term long range, continuation of above average precipitation. Now, that doesn't mean that we're running double what we should be this time of the year. I think it's more along the lines of just so consistent we are getting that light, moderate precipitation, and then we get hit with 3/4 of an inch or an inch or more. And last week, I know in northern Michigan, there were a number of reports of more than 3 inches of rain. And we're anticipating another prolonged damp period this week and all the way right through Easter, it appears right now. Our long range outlooks are indicating above average moisture.
Yeah, and you look at, you look out the window here today. It's another typical gray Michigan Tuesday here in spring, right? So if we don't get that sunshine, we can't get that ground to dry out and get in the field in time. And it's one of the things you look at precipitation patterns, whether it's spring, summer, fall. Some of these prolonged wetness periods seem to be becoming a little bit more frequent, and in some cases, the prolonged droughts also. You can look at what happened last spring, which is why we talked about a lot of beets were in already at this point last year. But it's one of those things, you get these 3, 4, 5 inch rains in that 1 to 3 day period, and it just takes time to dry out. And this time of the year without much sun, it's very difficult to do.
I think you hit a really important point, and Scott, I got a funny feeling you'll agree. We're not getting any evaporative loss. We are going to be looking at the possibility of some sun now out at the research station where you are. And Kurt, you're down in southern Michigan?
Yes.
So today, probably close to 11 o'clock or noon, the sun should come out and we should have some sun for the remainder of the day, but then the clouds will be moving in. So soil temperature wise, Kurt, we haven't really seen a lot of sub 32-degree nighttime temperatures. So the soil is taking the water, the tile are running. Is it really going to take very long for the soils to dry out if we have, let's say, a week of halfway decent weather?
It's a great question. It probably depends a little bit on which soil texture you're on, right? So if you talk about some of your sandy, coarse textured soils across the state, those tend to cool off and warm up much quicker than our fine textured soils, because those fine textured soils can hold a bit more water. So those lighter areas of the field, et cetera, those will dry out first. Those finer textured, heavier areas of the field will dry out later or last. So once we get some of these sunny days, yes, we can dry out on that surface fairly quickly on the lighter textured ground. Some of that heavier ground, you get up into the thumb, up into beet production areas. Sometimes that ground fools you, right? You can get that top 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch to dry out relatively quickly, and you think, oh man, we're getting close. It's time to go. But then you dig down to maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and it's just wet. So that really impacts whether you're just putting seed in the ground at planting time or whether you're using something like 2x2s for fertilizer application. All that really can impact what your spring plan is.
Those 2x2 coulters never lie. That's the truth. When you stick them down into that gum.
Yeah, I'll say, we've planted beets for years and years here now, and it's always, we've been fooled. I know early on in my career, yeah, you think it's dry enough and time to go, and then you plant a couple plots or a couple projects, and all of a sudden you realize, you see the beet seed lying on the surface and everything's plugged, right? And sure enough, you dig down a couple inches and it's just gummy, it's sticky, right? So it's usually when that surface dries, we usually have to wait another 3 to 4 days to plant, because we do a lot of subsurface nutrient application.
When we talk about field tile, I'm real curious. Scott, what are you seeing with a lot of our producers now? How much space in between the field tile? What are the guys doing?
It's definitely getting tighter, and for every farm, it's going to be different. We just talked to some growers yesterday who were splitting 25-foot tile. So you're definitely getting some serious drainage that 20 years ago we weren't discussing. And specifically for dry beans, we feel that's helped a lot of our issues. Everybody knows how fickle dry beans can be, and one thing they really do not like is wet feet. So the faster we can get that water off in season, the better off we are. So we do feel that's one thing that has helped our production system, and it's definitely changed a lot of things. And back to those precipitation patterns that we feel are changing a little bit. We're seeing more in-season stress, longer, prolonged times of drought, and then, these heavy rainfall spells. So that would kind of lead my question for Kurt. So when we're looking at that, potentially added stress throughout the season, do we have some key recommendations for our fertility programs, specifically focused on dry beans, but also across the rotation? And also keeping in mind the current fertilizer markets.
Yeah, I think you hit two key questions or two key topics there, Scott. One thing that we've talked about for a number of years, it's that 5-word phrase: start right to finish well, right? And it can apply to every cropping system we have in this great state of ours. And that's a lot of where starter fertilizer comes into play. Is starter fertilizer going to result in a yield response each and every year? Absolutely not. Right. But you look at the environmental variability, the climate variability that we've experienced here now over the last decade and a half, 2 decades. You can pick a month, whether it's April, May, June, July, August, and it's been excessively wet or excessively dry in the last 10, 12 years. And so we don't know, right? We don't know what the growing season is going to look like. You can even look at your 30, 60-day weather outlooks. We just don't know. We have an idea. But then, it might be dry for 4 weeks and we get that 5-inch rain. How do you plan for that? So that's where that start right to finish well really comes into play, is set that plan up for success early in the season to capitalize on those mid-season growing conditions, right? And sometimes it will just be a biomass response early in the season where you drive by that field and you see, that plant, whether it's dry beans, corn, etc. It might be a growth stage or 2 further ahead. And sometimes it will result in that yield response. But my vantage point has always been, I want that plant to be at the best that it can be whenever we hit that midsummer stress point, right? Whether it's too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold. And that's where some of that idea of starter fertilizer has really, really come into play. Now, that being said, fertilizer prices, I think, I've been talking about that for, probably 6 months now, right? Nothing new. It's probably the elephant in the room. We're looking at prices that are, ballpark at 60 to 90% greater than they were 2 springs ago when you compare to spring of 20. And so you really have to, look at that bottom line and sharpen your pencil on what you do or do not need to apply. And that's where one thing I started last fall talking about: make sure you have an up-to-date soil test, right? Make sure you know what's in that ground and whether you truly do or do not need to apply specific nutrients going into this upcoming growing season.
Are we looking at more in-row fertilization instead of broadcast?
Yeah, not necessarily. That's a great question. You start looking at in-row, if we're talking about pop-up or in furrow, that's not necessarily the case because we're really limited on the amount of nutrients you can apply in furrow, right? If you're talking some of your N-responsive crops, you're limited to, maybe about 5 pounds of N and K2O total. In some cases, we can bump that number up to about 7 or 8 pounds on some of the higher CEC soils, but that's it. So if you're talking about some of your more N-responsive crops, corn, you're talking, 170, 200 pounds of N. We're really only talking in furrow, 5, 7 pounds total, right? So where we're really talking about maybe 2x2 applications or 1x2s, whatever infrastructure you have, and then pre-plant applications, and then really focusing on phosphorus and potassium and whether you truly need to apply those this coming growing season, because that's where probably the bulk of your fertilizer savings will come from.
Scott, you mentioned that you have been talking with quite a few producers, quite a few farmers, and you had a meeting yesterday. What was the topic of conversation for the most part?
Yeah, so we were talking about a lot of topics, similar to this. How do you set your crop up, for success going into this year? A lot of guys, they might be down a few percent in acres from what they've managed in the past years, but we're looking at some pretty strong markets. You really want to capitalize on those inputs that you're putting in. So that'll kind of lead me to another question for Kurt. we talk about starter, and there's different ways guys, get that, starter on in dry beans. We've talked about, it's such a short growing season that we want to start right to finish well, as you've talked. Whether you get that on in a 2x2 or broadcast with your PPI herbicide. A lot of guys program that I'll hear is, say, well, what is your fertility program for dry beans? And they'll mention a 2 to 1 to 1, plus micros or plus sulfur. So meaning that their ratio between nitrogen, P, and K is at 2 to 1. How do you feel about that ratio? Does that vary based on soil test, or is that a pretty solid recommendation for a low input crop like beans?
Yeah, that's a great question there, Scott. When you talk about N, P, and K, if you focus on P and K, first it has to start on a soil test, right? So you can have, ratios of N to P and N to K application, et cetera, but it has to be based on that soil test. We know what the critical levels are for dry beans. If you're looking at Bray P1, you're looking at about 15 parts per million as that critical level for dry beans. And that optimal zone for phosphorus on dry beans is about 15 to 40 ppm on that Bray P1 scale. So that's where you want things to be, right? And so if you're in that zone or above that zone, this might be one of those years you do not need to apply phosphorus fertilizer. And the same thing with potassium. If you're growing dry beans on a low CEC soil, let's say CEC of 5 and under, your critical levels be about 100 parts per million on that Mehlich 3K scale. And if you're CEC above 5, your critical level will be about 120 parts per million. So if you're looking at that, you're substantially above that, you might be just fine not applying phos or potash fertilizer this coming growing season. You look at the N to S ratios, on corn, we're always looking at about, N to S ratio of 15 to 1, somewhere in that range. Sometimes it bumps up to about 18 to 1 or so. And we've done some sulfur work on dry beans. We haven't seen a great response. They're not one of the more N responsive crops, because those are the crops where we tend to see a little bit more of a sulfur response. Does it mean you're not going to get a sulfur response on dry beans? Absolutely not, right? But oftentimes we get a better sulfur response on something like corn and wheat. And then you can let some of that residual S build up and carry over to some of those less responsive crops, which might be something like soybeans and dry beans.
What do cover crops bring into this entire picture right now, guys?
Yeah, so I guess I'll kind of add to that question for Kurt. We've seen a lot of, beets ahead of dry beans, which is fit good in some guys' rotation. They say that they'll get a little bit less bean growth, following beets, which looking at white mold management can be a good thing. You're still getting those pods, but you're not getting that huge canopy. So a lot of times they'll have a pretty heavy stand of cereal rye, behind those sugar beets if they had time to get that broadcast. Work that down ahead of beans and plant into it. So thinking about that rotation, are there any special concerns to that?
Yeah, one thing is, oftentimes with dry beans following sugar beets, you want to make sure your zinc levels are appropriate, because sometimes you see a little bit more of a zinc deficiency following sugar beets. So your more zinc responsive crops would be something like corn and dry beans. So that would be something to keep an eye on. But you start talking about cover crops going into dry beans, and dry beans offer a great opportunity to have cover crops before you plant, from the last or preceding crop, and after harvest, right? Because it is a shorter season crop. And so some of those covers that lead into dry beans can scavenge some of that residual nitrate in that field. Also a little bit of P and K. And then as you terminate that cover crop, that can break down and mineralize and become available to that ensuing dry bean crop. So it is a great opportunity to kind of close that cycle, right? To close that leak in the system a little bit, where we don't have something actively growing 12 months out of the year. That's where cover crops can really kind of tighten that cycle and maybe, lead us down that path of a little bit more sustainable of a production system.
Are growers going to more cover? Are you seeing that, Scott?
That's definitely something we've observed over the past 10 plus years. We've done a production practices survey through the Michigan Bean Commission for, the past 20 years probably. And that is one of the questions that we asked, and we've definitely seen it grow. We feel we've reached a little bit of a plateau with it, that on average, over 50% of the growers surveyed, well, I guess better way to state that would be 50% of the acres surveyed, had a cover crop annually. And that's kind of where it fits into that rotation. And, following some crops, it doesn't work as well, but, maybe following early dig sugar beets, you've got that time to be able to get things spread. After corn can be a challenge. A lot of times after edible beans, we'll have wheat planted. Sometimes that wheat is kept as a crop, and sometimes it's a cover too, to lead into some other crops. So we've definitely seen that number increase as that adoption has picked up across the Thumb and Saginaw Valley, which overall is a good thing.
Back years ago, I noticed that after the wheat was harvested, there was clover coming up, and that clover was there and then plowed down in the spring, and then the dry beans were put in. Have we gotten away from that?
I wouldn't think we've gotten away from it. We still see it out there. And a lot of times, looking at nitrogen use rates, that's one of the big questions we always have is, after a heavy stand of clover, what should our recommendation be for nitrogen? And a lot of times, if we run an end response test on those in partnership with Kurt, we're not seeing a response to supplemental nitrogen. But a lot of that, is dependent on rainfall, weather, soil temperatures, and all those things that complicate that question a little bit.
Kurt, follow up on that?
Yeah, Scott's right. When you look at clover as a cover, we can get a pretty significant end contribution. And so usually with a crop like dry beans, that's a little bit lower on the end response spectrum. Many times it can be enough N to offset the need for any additional inorganic N that needs to get applied. And that kind of leads into another question probably that you touched on a little bit, Scott, too, and that's white mold. Right, we look at N applications on dry beans, and that's one thing we really have to caution ourselves on, whether it's narrow or even wide row beans, is that a little bit too much, and we get this lush canopy growth, and man, that white mold just takes off. And so it's something, sometimes, some is good, more is better with nitrogen on dry beans. That isn't necessarily the case because we end up with a whole nother group of issues to deal with later in the season.
Scott, your thoughts?
Yeah, you definitely reach a tipping point in there. You talk to any old timer in the industry, and they've experienced it at some point in time, whether it was trying to manage a cover crop and never being sure how much nitrogen they had available, or looking at some different manure rates, and then trying to find that sweet spot of enough N but not too much. We've all seen that crop that looks beautiful, it's tall, it's lush, it's dense, and then you come through flowering, and all of a sudden you see that mold infection, and it's definitely not what we desire to see in our crop. And kind of coming back to that organic sources of N, we've had a lot of discussion about the fertilizer markets and the cost of inorganic N. We've also had some growers adopting the use of poultry litter and some other organic sources of N. I guess, Kurt, do you have any comments on that too, of the timing of those applications? I know we're getting late in the spring here too. How do you feel about that ahead of beans?
Yeah, I've heard more probably manure discussions or questions or talking points this winter than probably, than the previous 5, 6, 7 years combined, right? In some cases, it's even hard to find. You've heard some manure sources are sold out till midsummer, etc. So definitely, I think there's interest. Couple key points to keep in mind with those that did get manure put down in the fall. If it's before soil temperatures drop below 50 degrees, that manure N can mineralize to nitrate or can nitrify to nitrate relatively quickly. Right. So some of that may or may not stick around going into springtime. So that would be one thing to caution themselves on. And then the other thing with manure applications, oftentimes you want to do something like a PSNT test, right? come late May, early June, do a pre-citrus nitrate test to try to determine how much nitrate is in that soil profile. And then whether you use a private lab, public lab, etc., they all have documentation on when that PSNT test comes back, whatever level it is at, what sort of N credit you can give that ensuing crop. And so I think for those that might be new to the manure application market, that would be something to consider if you did get manure put on last fall or here early in the spring.
Scott, out at the research farm, undoubtedly you're going to have some dry beans in. Just kind of curious, what are you looking at right now?
Yeah, so we'll have quite a few projects on this farm this year. We always host our breeding trial for our MSU dry bean breeder, Dr. Francisco Gomez. So in total, that takes between 20 and 30 acres worth of breeding trials just for that program. On top of that, we do have a USDA breeder here as well, Dr. Karen Seehey. Usually that's about another 10 acres. So most of the blocks here are in about 30 acres. So we'll have one full breeding block just with that trial. We will have a second year of, we called it a cover crop trial, where we looked at some different practices of seeding cover crops ahead of dry beans using a vertical tillage tool that we have here at the farm, looking at some different rates of cereal covers like rye, wheat, and oats. So we'll have about another 20 acres into a strip trial project looking at that. So overall, we should actually have a fairly big dry bean year here on the research farm, in addition to all the other on-farm research that we do.
Kurt, any closing thoughts?
Sit tight and see where things go, right? I think we've talked about prices, both commodity and input prices, all fall and all winter. Input prices were high last fall and going into the winter already, prior to some of the international conflicts going on right now. So I've gotten lots of questions on current events and how that's causing high fertilizer prices, but fertilizer prices were up prior to that. So I think the big question is going to come into what type of spring and summer do we have, right? If we have a good production year, that might make up for some of the high prices that we're currently seeing. And then I think probably the bigger issue of discussion might be if these prices stick around, we can usually get through 1 year of looking at where the bottom line is right now. But going into this late summer fall period, if prices are still where they're currently at or higher, that could be a whole nother issue going into then 2023.
Scott, same to you. Closing thoughts?
Yeah, we definitely appreciate Kurt's time today, and the comments are very well appreciated. As we talked with this little bit of a delay in season, it's definitely got growers still thinking, and all these comments were great of how to make the most out of our inputs and stretch our dollars as far as we can, and hopefully have a strong production year.
And Kurt, you're going to be on the internet again this week, coming up on Thursday. What are you going to be talking about?
Oh, I'm going to try to limit it to a short time. Just some last minute points on maybe some nitrogen thoughts, some sulfur thoughts, some of the P and K stuff we talked here today a little bit, and then hopefully cover a few of the common questions I've gotten over the course of the winter with regards to both pricing and fertilizer and what may or may not be available to that grower going into this season. So that'll be, yes, Thursday morning, bright and early at 7 a.m.
Yeah, we're talking Field Crops Virtual Breakfast. I'm sorry, guys, I couldn't provide anything to eat or drink this morning. But on Thursday, Kurt, it's going to be up to you, right?
There we go. I'll have some interesting tidbits to make everybody satisfied going into the upcoming growing season.
There we go.
Coffee.
Yeah,
Coffee's always good.
Yeah, you bet. Scott Bales, Kurt Stanke, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it on this edition of Talking Beans. I'm Terry Henney. On behalf of BASF, have a great day.
It's never just been a field. It's a lab where beakers and vials are corn stalks and bean pods. It's 1,000 dinners on 1,000 plates throughout the world. It's the engine of the American economy. It's our survival. It's never been just a field. It's our future. All of ours. Your field is the future. BASF, we create chemistry.